Chapter 1. The Midnight Train. The night was cold and damp when the midnight train whistled for the last time before departing. The lights of the Gare de Lyon station in Paris twinkled in the mist, intermittently illuminating the luxurious train that was preparing for a journey of mystery and danger to Istanbul. The cabins, adorned with gold and mahogany details, gleamed under the soft light, promising comfort and whispered secrets. Marcello, a private detective with a keen eye and a troubled past, boarded with a purpose known only to him. His calloused hands firmly held a small leather suitcase, and his eyes scanned every face on the platform, analyzing, suspecting. He knew this journey would be anything but ordinary. The first person to catch his attention was a stunning woman wrapped in a white fur coat. Her green eyes, contrasting with her wavy black hair, had an enigmatic sparkle. The socialite, known as Madame Elvira, exuded a dangerous elegance. She glided through the train corridor as if she owned it, her jewelry sparkling under the amber lights. Next, a visibly nervous businessman hurriedly entered. His movements were abrupt and clumsy, and he held his ticket so tightly it seemed he might tear it. Marcello recognized him from some photos in business newspapers. Albert Duval, a magnate in the textile industry whose investments had recently collapsed. He settled into his cabin, casting furtive glances at everyone who passed by. Lastly, the train conductor, a middle-aged man with a carefully trimmed mustache and dark eyes that seemed to hide more than they revealed. His name was Jean-Luc, and he had an impeccable reputation among travelers. But Marcello knew that even the most respected men harbor secrets. The train began to move smoothly, and Marcello leaned back in his seat, watching the Parisian landscape fade into darkness. The train wheels made a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound as he reflected on the strange coincidences that led him to this journey. In the dining car, Madame Elvira and Albert Duval met by chance. Or perhaps it wasn't so accidental. They exchanged tense looks and sharp words that Marcello, seated a few meters away, couldn't help but notice. "You should be more careful, Elvira," Albert whispered with a tone of veiled threat. "It's none of your business, Albert. Take care of your own problems before they take care of you," she retorted, not even glancing up from the menu. Marcello knew something significant was about to happen. He could feel it in the heavy air of cigarettes and expensive perfumes. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the train, but inside, secrets were beginning to emerge. As the train advanced into the night, Marcello lit a cigarette, his eyes never ceasing to observe the passengers. He was there to solve a mystery, and his instincts told him that this mystery was about to unfold in an unexpected and dangerous way. Chapter 2. First Clues. Darkness enveloped the midnight train as it cut through the shadowy French countryside. The full moon peeked through heavy clouds, casting a silvery glow on the tracks that wound into the unknown. Inside the train, the tension grew with each passing kilometer. Marcello walked through the narrow corridors, his boots softly echoing on the wooden floor. His sharp eyes caught every movement, every nervous sigh. He knew that mysteries began to reveal themselves in small details, in averted glances, and in furtive whispers. In the dining car, Madame Elvira sat at a table by the window, sipping a glass of red wine. Her posture was serene, but her emerald eyes were fixed on something or someone across the car. Marcello followed her gaze and saw Albert Duval, the businessman, fidgeting restlessly in his seat. His hands trembled slightly as he held a glass of whiskey, seemingly trying to find courage at the bottom of the glass. Marcello approached discreetly, pretending to be interested in the menu. He managed to catch fragments of the conversation between Elvira and Albert. "Do you really think you can escape your mistakes, Albert?" Elvira said, her voice low but full of venom. "I have no choice, Elvira. You know what's at stake here," Albert replied, his eyes wide with fear. Before Marcello could hear more, a figure interrupted his line of sight. It was the conductor Jean-Luc, making his rounds through the car. He greeted the passengers with a cordial smile, but his cold eyes met Marcelo's for a brief moment. There was something unsettling in that look, something that suggested Jean-Luc knew more than he let on. Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass made everyone turn. A champagne bottle had fallen from a nearby table, scattering fragments on the floor. A young couple, visibly embarrassed, hurried to clean up the mess. Marcelo noted how the situation created a perfect distraction, allowing Elvira and Albert to finish their conversation in even lower whispers. Determined to uncover what was happening, Marcelo headed towards the sleeping cabins. The corridor was deserted, except for a small, agile figure he almost missed. A child, no more than 10 years old, was peeking through the ajar door of one of the cabins. Her curious and attentive eyes met Marcelo's for a moment before she disappeared into the shadows. Intrigued, Marcelo turned his attention to the cabin where the child had been peeking. He saw only an elderly woman knitting silently, her expression calm. Nothing seemed suspicious there, but Marcelo knew that even the most innocent appearances could be deceiving. He continued his round through the train, passing by closed cabins. From one of them, he heard the muffled sound of voices arguing. He stopped, pressing his ear against the door. The voices were indistinct, but the tone was clearly one of conflict. "You shouldn't be here," said a male voice, full of anger. "I had no choice. They're following me," replied a female voice, desperate. Before he could hear more, the door abruptly opened, and a tall, burly man emerged, almost bumping into Marcelo. His eyes met Marcelo's for a moment, filled with fury and fear, before he quickly walked away down the corridor. The woman remained at the door for a second, her eyes glistening with tears. She closed the door with a snap before Marcelo could ask anything. With his mind full of questions and no clear answers, Marcelo returned to his cabin. He knew he was dealing with something much larger than mere coincidences. The midnight train was carrying more than passengers on a luxury journey. It was carrying secrets, dangers, and perhaps something deadly. Chapter 3. The Crime. Midnight was approaching, and the midnight train advanced through the darkness like a serpent of metal. The atmosphere inside the train was dense, almost palpable, laden with unspoken secrets and hidden fears. Marcelo, with his penetrating gaze, felt every second pass, like the heavy beat of an invisible clock. The dining car was nearly empty now, except for Madame Elvira, who was still savoring her wine, and the businessman Albert Duval, who had retired to his cabin. Marcelo stood up, determined to explore further, when a piercing scream shattered the silence of the night. Everyone froze for a moment, the sound echoing through the corridors like the cry of a lost soul. Marcelo ran toward the sound, his steps firm and quick. He reached Albert Duval's cabin, the door slightly ajar. Carefully pushing it open, the scene that unfolded before his eyes was one of pure horror. Albert lay on the floor, his lifeless body in a slowly spreading pool of blood on the carpet. His eyes were open but lifeless, staring into nothingness. Marcelo knelt beside the body, quickly noting the details. A deep wound in the abdomen, clearly the result of a stabbing. There was no sign of the murder weapon, indicating that the killer had taken it with them. The sound of hurried footsteps caught Marcelo's attention. Conductor Jean-Luc appeared at the door, his expression horrified at the sight. Behind him, Madame Elvira approached, a hand covering her mouth in shock. "My God, what happened?" Jean-Luc exclaimed, his eyes wide. "He's been murdered, why?" Marcelo replied coldly, standing up. "We need to gather everyone in the dining car. No one leaves this train until I find out who did this." Jean-Luc nodded and ran off to call the other passengers. Marcelo, with a determined look, began to inspect the cabin more closely. Papers were scattered across the table, some with hurried notes and others with figures that made no immediate sense. He picked up one of the papers, noticing a blood stain suggesting Albert was writing something when he was attacked. Madame Elvira stood in the doorway, still in shock. "Did you know him well?" Marcelo asked, observing her closely. "Not as well as I thought," she replied, her voice trembling. "We had business dealings, but I didn't know he was in so much danger." Before Marcelo could ask more, the other passengers began to arrive. There was a mix of fear and curiosity on their faces. Among them were the young couple who had dropped the champagne bottle earlier, and the elderly woman who had been knitting in her cabin. "Everyone to the dining car," Marcelo ordered. "We need to talk." In the dining car, the tension was palpable. Marcelo began to question each one, looking for anything that might indicate guilt or innocence. The answers were evasive, the expressions cautious. Each of them had something to hide, but who would be capable of murder? Madame Elvira sat on one side, still holding her wine glass as if it were a shield. Jean-Luc, now with a more professional demeanor, stood by the door, keeping a vigilant eye on everyone. The young couple looked lost, their eyes wide with fear. "Did anyone see or hear anything unusual before the scream?" Marcelo asked, his gaze sweeping the room. The response was a collective silence, broken only by the distant sound of the moving train. Then, a small and timid voice spoke up. It was the child Marcelo had seen peeking earlier. She stood up slowly, her eyes wide and haunted. "I saw someone in the corridor," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But it was dark. I couldn't see who it was." Marcelo nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Where were you and what did you see exactly?" "I was going to get a glass of water for my grandmother," the child said, pointing to the elderly woman who had been knitting. "I saw a shadow moving quickly in the corridor. It looked like they were in a hurry." Marcelo looked at the elderly woman, who confirmed with a nod. "She always brings me water before bed," the woman said softly. Marcelo knew the investigation was just beginning, but that small clue could be crucial. He looked at each of the faces in the dining car, knowing that among them was the killer. And he would not stop until he discovered the truth. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. In the dining car, the atmosphere was heavy with tension and fear. Marcelo stood, his determined gaze sweeping across the pale faces of the gathered passengers. He knew the killer was among them, and every passing second was another chance for the culprit to cover their tracks. "We need order," Marcelo said, his firm voice cutting through the tense silence. "No one will leave this train until I have spoken with each of you. The dining car will be our base of operations." The passengers exchanged glances, murmuring their concerns and anxieties. Conductor Jean-Luc made a calming gesture, asking everyone to settle at the surrounding tables. Marcelo began with Madame Elvira, who sat by the window, still clutching her wine glass. "Madame Elvira," Marcelo began, sitting across from her, "you seem to know Mr. Duval well. Can you tell me about your relationship with him?" Elvira sighed, her gaze fixed on the red liquid in her glass. "Albert and I had a complicated business partnership," she finally said. "He invested a large sum in one of my ventures, but recently we had disagreements. But that doesn't mean I would kill him." "Disagreements?" Marcelo raised an eyebrow. "What kind of disagreements?" "Albert was becoming paranoid," Elvira explained. "He thought everyone was against him, including me. But I just wanted to reclaim what was rightfully mine." Marcelo watched her for a moment, looking for any sign of deceit, but Elvira remained steadfast, her gaze challenging. He stood up and approached the young couple, who were still visibly shaken. "You two," Marcelo said, pulling up a chair. "Tell me about the broken bottle in the dining car. It was an accident, correct?" The young man nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. My wife and I were celebrating our wedding anniversary. We were excited and careless. It was truly an accident." The woman beside him confirmed with a nod, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't see anything suspicious, sir," she added. "We were just trying to enjoy the trip." Marcelo dismissed them with a nod, turning to the elderly woman and her granddaughter. The child, who seemed a bit more at ease, still held a curious gaze. You said you saw a shadow in the corridor, Marcelo began, speaking softly to avoid scaring her. Can you tell me more about that? Any detail could help. The girl bit her lip, thoughtful. It was a tall person, she finally said. They were moving fast, almost running. I couldn't see their face. The elderly woman stroked her granddaughter's hair, her expression worried. I was knitting in our cabin, she said, her voice trembling. My granddaughter only went out to get water. We weren't expecting any of this. Marcelo nodded, thanking them both before turning to conductor Jean-Luc. He had been standing aside, observing everything with a thoughtful expression. Jean-Luc, Marcelo began, crossing his arms. You've worked on this train for a long time. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Jean-Luc shook his head, his mustache trembling slightly. Never, sir. The midnight train has always been a symbol of luxury and safety. This is Nando Stachinkas. San and Sai, Char Tui Tui. Jinable. Do you know the passengers well? Marcelo asked. Did any of them strike you as suspicious? Jean-Luc hesitated. Well, Madame Elvira has always been a notable figure, but nothing I would consider suspicious. Mr. Duval, however, was acting strange since he boarded. He seemed nervous, like he was expecting something bad to happen. Marcelo pondered these pieces of information as he looked at the faces of the passengers, all visibly shaken. He knew the key to solving this mystery lay somewhere among those expressions of fear and anxiety. The investigation was just beginning, and Marcelo was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deep or dangerous the rabbit hole might be. Chapter 5. Suspects and Motives. Marcelo observed the passengers gathered in the dining car, all tense and apprehensive. He knew that each of them harbored secrets, and uncovering the truth meant carefully unearthing these buried lies. Let's start with Madame Elvira, Marcelo said, signaling for her to approach again. She rose gracefully, but there was a hardness in her gaze. Madame Elvira, Marcelo began, crossing his arms, you mentioned disagreements with Mr. Duval. Can you tell us more about these differences? Did they ever become threatening? Elvira took a deep breath, her jewelry tinkling lightly with the movement. Albert was losing money on his investments and started accusing me of betrayal, she said firmly. He believed I was conspiring against him to ruin him. He even threatened to sue me, but I would never do such a thing. I needed his investments as much as he needed my business. Marcelo nodded but wasn't entirely convinced. And did you ever threaten him? She looked directly into Marcelo's eyes, her gaze cold. I told him that if he continued with his baseless accusations, I would withdraw my stake and let him sink alone. But I didn't kill him. Marcelo turned to the young couple. You two, he said, indicating for them to come closer. I need to understand why you were so agitated before the bottle fell. Were you arguing about something? The young man quickly shook his head. No, sir. We were just happy. It was a celebration, you know. Maybe a bit too much champagne, but no argument. The woman beside him nodded. We were discussing our future, plans for life. We didn't see anything strange until that moment. But, Marcelo insisted, did you see or hear anything after the scream? The man hesitated, exchanging looks with his wife before speaking. We thought we heard hurried footsteps in the corridor, but when we stepped out, we didn't see anyone. It seemed like everyone was coming out of their cabins at the same time. Marcelo thanked them and turned to the elderly woman and her granddaughter. And you, anything out of the ordinary besides what you've already told me? The elderly woman shook her head. No, sir. I was knitting, and my granddaughter went to get water. We didn't see anything besides the shadow in the corridor. The child, however, bit her lip and looked at the floor. I think I saw a glint, she said softly. Something metallic, like a knife, but it was very quick. Marcelo frowned. Can you point out where exactly you saw this? The girl pointed vaguely in the direction of the main corridor. There, near the cabins. The last person Marcelo needed to question was Conductor Jean-Luc. "You mentioned that Mr. Duval was nervous," Marcelo began. "Did you notice anything else about his behavior? Did he talk to anyone in particular?" Jean-Luc rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, he seemed to avoid eye contact with almost everyone, except... Now that I think about it, he had a conversation with a man who isn't here now. A tall man, wearing a dark coat. I didn't see him among the passengers after the scream." Marcelo felt a wave of frustration. "Can you describe this man in more detail?" Jean-Luc shook his head. "I only saw him briefly, but he seemed to be in a hurry and had a menacing air, perhaps an accomplice or someone with unfinished business with Mr. Duval." Marcelo felt he was getting closer to something, but he still didn't have all the pieces. He needed to connect the dots and find out who had the strongest motive and the opportunity to commit the murder. As the passengers exchanged nervous glances, Marcelo stepped away to reflect. Each of them had a possible motive to want Duval dead, but who would have gone that far? Marcelo pondered the information he had gathered. Madame Elvira had a complicated business relationship with Duval. The young couple were seemingly innocent, but had heard footsteps, and the elderly woman and her granddaughter had seen shadows and a metallic glint. The presence of an unknown man in a dark coat added another layer of mystery. He decided to take a different approach. "I need to see everyone's personal belongings," he announced. "Anything that could be used as a weapon or contain clues." The passengers reluctantly agreed, and Jean-Luc helped Marcelo inspect the cabins. They found nothing significant in the young couple's or the elderly woman's belongings. However, when they reached Madame Elvira's cabin, Marcelo's keen eyes noticed a small bloodstain on a piece of fabric tucked away in her luggage. "Madame Elvira, can you explain this?" Marcelo asked, holding up the fabric. Elvira's face paled. That's not mine. I don't know how it got there." Marcelo scrutinized her, sensing her fear. "We will need to analyze this further. For now, everyone stays in their cabins. No one moves until I say so." As Marcelo continued his search, he found a hidden compartment in Duval's cabin. Inside was a set of documents revealing financial ties and debts to several people, including Madame Elvira, and a letter threatening him if he didn't repay soon. The signature was smudged, but the initials JL were clear. Jean-Luc, Marcelo thought, piecing it together. He must be involved. He returned to confront the conductor. "Jean-Luc, what do these initials mean to you?" Marcelo asked, showing him the letter. Jean-Luc's face turned ashen. I don't know." Marcelo wasn't convinced. "We will find out soon enough." The investigation was far from over, but Marcelo felt a breakthrough was imminent. The midnight train carried more than just passengers. It carried dark secrets and deadly motives, and Marcelo was determined to unveil them all. Chapter 6. Contradictory Evidence. Marcelo withdrew to Albert Duval's cabin, where the blood had not yet dried on the carpet. He needed a moment alone to sift through the scene for any clue that might unravel the mystery. The cabin was cluttered with papers, letters, and personal items scattered haphazardly. He started at the desk, where he found an open diary. The last pages were chaotic, written in haste. Albert had mentioned someone named M several times. The notes suggested he was afraid of M and believed this person was plotting against him. Marcelo frowned. Who could M be? Rummaging through the small writing desk, he found a sealed envelope with Elvira handwritten on it. Marcelo carefully opened it. Inside was a letter in which Albert threatened to expose compromising secrets about Elvira if she did not return his money. The tension between them was palpable, but was it enough motive for murder? Suddenly, a metallic sound caught Marcelo's attention. He crouched down and saw a piece of metal under the bed, Carefully pulling it out, he revealed a small, blood-stained knife, meticulously hidden. He knew the murder weapon was right there, concealed under everyone's nose. But why leave it in the victim's own cabin? It seemed like a desperate attempt to frame someone. With the knife wrapped in a handkerchief, Marcelo left the cabin and returned to the dining car. The passengers were in a state of nervous tension, murmuring among themselves. He placed the knife on the central table, drawing everyone's attention. "This is the murder weapon," Marcelo said firmly. "It was found in Mr. Duval's cabin, but the question is, who put it there?" The passengers exchanged nervous glances. Madame Elvira remained impassive, but her eyes shone with a strange light. The young couple looked even more anxious, while the elderly woman and her granddaughter remained silent, watching everything attentively. "Miss Elvira," Marcelo continued, turning his gaze to her, "Mr. Duval mentioned threats in letters addressed to you. He seemed to believe you wanted his ruin. How do you explain this?" Elvira lifted her chin, her voice full of conviction. "Albert was paranoid. He was sinking in his own bad decisions and looking for someone to blame. I would never threaten him physically. Yes, I wanted my money back, but I am not a murderer." Marcelo then turned to the young couple. "You were near the crime scene. Did you see or hear anything besides the footsteps in the corridor?" The young man swallowed hard, visibly nervous. "We didn't see who it was, but we heard a voice, a male voice, but we couldn't make out the words. It all happened very fast." Marcelo frowned, analyzing the information. There was still something that didn't add up, something he was missing. He looked at the knife on the table again, trying to connect the dots. "Elderly lady," Marcelo said, turning to her, "your granddaughter mentioned seeing a metallic glint. Could it have been this knife? Do you confirm?" The elderly woman nodded slowly. "Yes, it seems that was it. But I didn't see who was carrying it." The child leaned forward, her voice low, but clear. "I saw someone in the shadows, but it was quick, very quick, and the knife seemed too small to cause such damage." Marcelo looked at the knife again. The girl was right. It was small, but still lethal. There was something deeper going on, a layer of deceit he had not yet uncovered. The evidence was there, but it seemed to contradict the initial suspicions. Suddenly, an idea struck him. What if the real killer was trying to deliberately shift the blame? What if there was someone else involved, someone everyone had overlooked or ignored? Marcelo felt he was getting closer to the truth, but he knew he needed to press harder to bring the secrets to light. "Jean-Luc," Marcelo called out, turning to the conductor, "I need to know more about the man you mentioned earlier, the tall man in the dark coat. Are you certain he's not among the passengers?" Jean-Luc looked troubled. "I'm certain, sir. I haven't seen him since before the scream." Marcelo nodded. "I want you to search the entire train for any sign of this man. Check every cabin, every compartment." As Jean-Luc and a few passengers began searching, Marcelo turned his attention back to the others. This knife was hidden in a place where it could be easily found, but also easily overlooked. It suggests someone who knows this train well. He looked at Madame Elvira, the young couple, and the elderly woman and her granddaughter. "One of you knows more than you're saying. I will find out who." Marcelo felt the pressure of time weighing on him. The train would eventually reach its next stop, and the killer might try to escape. He needed to piece together the conflicting evidence and uncover the truth before it was too late. Chapter 7. Plot Twist. The silence in the dining car was almost oppressive. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the blood-stained knife on the table, each mind working frantically to understand how the pieces of the puzzle fit together. Marcelo, with his experience and instinct, knew he was one step away from uncovering the truth. He just needed one more push. "Someone here is lying," Marcelo said, his voice firm and sharp, "and I'm about to find out who." He began to walk around the car, his eyes scrutinizing each passenger. He stopped in front of Jean-Luc, the conductor, who seemed more nervous with each passing second. "Jean-Luc, You mentioned a tall man in a dark coat. Are you sure he was on this train? And where is he now?" Jean-Luc hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. I only saw him briefly. He might have gotten off at the last stop, but I'm not sure." Marcelo frowned. "And you didn't think this was important to mention before? A mysterious figure disappears, and you don't think to inform anyone?" Jean-Luc swallowed hard, his words coming out hesitantly. "I thought maybe he was just a regular passenger. I didn't want to cause alarm without reason." Marcelo sensed there was more to it, something Jean-Luc was hiding. "And what about your past, Jean-Luc? Is there something you'd like to tell us?" The conductor seemed about to respond when the car door suddenly opened. An unexpected figure entered, a tall, middle-aged man wearing a dark coat, exactly as Jean-Luc had described. All eyes turned to him and the air grew thick with tension. "Who are you?" Marcelo asked, stepping forward. "My name is Jacques," said the man, his voice deep and calm. "I'm a private investigator. I was hired by Mr. Duval to protect him during this trip. But it seems I failed." Shock rippled through the car. Marcelo narrowed his eyes. "And why didn't you introduce yourself earlier?" Jacques shrugged. "I was following a lead. I thought someone was trying to sabotage the trip. I didn't expect things to escalate to this point." "Were you with him when he was murdered?" Marcelo asked, suspicion rising in his voice. "No," Jacques admitted. "I was inspecting the baggage car when I heard the scream. By the time I arrived, it was too late." Jacques' arrival further complicated the case. Marcelo felt he was close, but the pieces still didn't fit perfectly. He needed to press harder. "Jean-Luc," Marcelo said, turning back to the conductor. "Did you and Mr. Duval have any connection beyond this trip?" Jean-Luc hesitated before speaking. I knew Mr. Duval from years ago. We had a disagreement over business. But I would never hurt him." Marcelo sensed this was the key. "And was that disagreement serious enough for him to threaten you?" Jean-Luc nodded slowly. "He threatened to ruin my career, to expose me. He said I didn't deserve to be working here." Marcelo knew he had found a strong motive. "And what did you do, Jean-Luc, when he made those threats?" Jean-Luc looked on the verge of collapse. I tried to reason with him, but he was adamant. I was scared. Yes, but I didn't kill him." Suddenly, the child who had seen the shadow in the corridor tugged on Marcelo's sleeve. "I remembered something," she said, her voice small but clear. "The man I saw, he had something in his pocket, something that shone." Marcelo turned to Jacques. "Were you carrying a weapon, Jacques?" Jacques shook his head. "Just a revolver, for protection, not a knife." The mystery deepened, but Marcelo felt he was finally closing in on the truth. He needed to piece together the evidence and ask the right question to unravel it all. Marcelo addressed the group again. "It's clear that Mr. Duval was afraid of someone. Jean-Luc had a motive due to past threats. Jacques was hired to protect him, yet wasn't present during the murder. And there's a mysterious man, supposedly seen but not found." He turned his attention back to Jacques. "You said you were following a lead. What was it?" Jacques sighed. "I found out Mr. Duval was being blackmailed. Someone was threatening to reveal damaging information if he didn't pay up. I was trying to find out who it was." Marcelo's mind raced. The pieces began to fall into place. "Jean-Luc, did you ever receive money from Mr. Duval?" Jean-Luc shook his head vehemently. "No, never. He only threatened me." Marcelo's gaze swept the room again, landing on Madame Elvira. "And you, Madame Elvira, did you ever blackmail Mr. Duval?" Elvira's eyes widened in shock. "No, I wanted my money back, but I would never stoop to blackmail." Then Marcelo had a revelation. The initials M in Duval's diary. It could stand for Marcelo, Madame, or even man. But what if it stood for something else, something more personal? He turned to the child. "Young lady, can you tell me again what you saw in the corridor?" The girl nodded. I saw a tall man with something shiny in his pocket. Marcelo pondered this. Jacques, show us what's in your pockets. Reluctantly, Jacques emptied his pockets. Among the items was a shiny pen, not a weapon. Marcelo looked at the knife again. This knife is small, easily hidden. Jean-Luc, would you mind rolling up your sleeves? Jean-Luc complied, revealing a small cut on his arm, still fresh. How did you get that cut? Marcelo asked sharply. Jean-Luc stammered. I must have nicked myself during my rounds. Marcelo took a deep breath. The man who was blackmailing Mr. Duval knew he was vulnerable. Jean-Luc, you had access to everything on this train. You could have placed the knife under Duval's bed to mislead us. Jean-Luc's face went pale. I didn't do it. Marcelo's voice softened. We will find out the truth, but right now everything points to you. Your past with Duval, the threats, and now this cut. We need to secure you until we reach the next stop. Jean-Luc was taken aback, but didn't resist as he was escorted to a secure area. Marcelo looked at the remaining passengers. This isn't over yet. We still have to verify everything. But I believe we are close to finding the truth. As the train sped towards its destination, Marcelo knew the next few hours would be crucial in solving the mystery once and for all. Chapter 8. Confrontation and Revelations. The tension in the dining car was electrifying. Marcelo, with his sharp gaze, knew he was on the right track. He needed just one more piece to complete the puzzle. Fixing his eyes on Jacques, he felt this was the moment to uncover the hidden secrets. Jacques, Marcelo began, his voice laden with authority. You said you were following a lead. Can you tell us more about that? And why did Mr. Duval feel the need to hire extra protection? Jacques took a deep breath, as if gathering courage to speak. Mr. Duval believed someone was after him because of a business deal that went wrong. He didn't give me many details, but mentioned that a very powerful person was determined to seek revenge. You said you were in the baggage car during the murder, Marcelo continued. What exactly were you looking for there? I was checking a suspicion, Jacques replied, his dark eyes fixed on Marcelo. I thought someone might have hidden something there, something that could incriminate Mr. Duval or even threaten his life. Did you find anything? Marcelo asked. Jacques shook his head. Nothing relevant, just luggage and boxes, but when I heard the scream, I ran back. As Jacques spoke, Marcelo noticed that Madame Elvira was restless. There was something in her behavior that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Determined to press further, he turned to her. Madame Elvira, you were with Mr. Duval shortly before the murder, Marcelo said. And as we've seen, you had a rather tumultuous relationship. Can you tell us more about what really happened? Elvira let out an exasperated sigh, her emerald eyes shining with a mix of anger and sadness. Albert was desperate. He wanted to recover his money, but he had no way to do it. He started blaming me for all his problems. Our argument was heated, but I left him before anything happened. You were with him until just before midnight, Marcelo continued. After that, where did you go? I went to my cabin, Elvira replied. I was exhausted from that ridiculous argument. I was trying to calm down. Marcelo knew he needed more information. Turning to Jean-Luc, he asked, You said you knew Mr. Duval from a previous business deal. What kind of deal was it? Jean-Luc looked hesitant, but finally spoke. It was an investment in a real estate venture. I was involved in the supervision, but Albert accused me of embezzling funds. It was a misunderstanding, but he never let it go. You would have had reasons for wanting revenge, Marcelo suggested. Yes, but I didn't kill him, Jean-Luc said, his voice full of frustration. I wanted to clear my name, not take his life. At that moment, the child who had mentioned the shadow in the corridor stood up again. I remembered something else, she said hesitantly. I saw a piece of paper fall out of the pocket of the person who was running. It looked important. Marcelo looked at the girl, intrigued. "Did you pick up that paper?" The girl nodded and handed over a crumpled piece of paper. Marcelo opened it and read quickly. It was a note written hastily, with Madame Elvira's name, and a significant amount of money mentioned. It was a crucial clue. "Ma'am Elvira," Marcelo said, his voice taking on an accusatory tone. "This note suggests you had something to do with Albert's financial situation. Was he trying to recover his money through you?" Elvira seemed surprised to see the note. That was an attempt at a settlement. Albert wanted to pay me to end the matter, but this has nothing to do with his murder." Marcelo was about to respond when Jean-Luc interrupted. "Wait, I recognize this handwriting," he said, taking the paper. "It's not Albert's, it's Jacques." All eyes turned to Jacques, whose expression hardened. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice lacked its previous firmness. "Jacques," Marcelo said, stepping closer, "it seems you were more involved than you admitted. Perhaps you were trying to frame someone, but something went wrong." Jacques took a step back, the tension rising. "I was just doing my job." Marcelo moved closer, his gaze fixed on Jacques. "Your job was to protect Duval, but it seems you had your own interests. Did you kill him to cover something bigger?" Jacques finally broke, his posture collapsing. "He found out something he shouldn't have," he admitted. "He was blackmailing me, threatening to expose my connections with a criminal group. I had no choice." The train filled with murmurs as Marcelo put the final pieces together. The real killer was unmasked, but the truth was darker than he had imagined. "He was trying to extort you," Marcelo summarized, "and when he pushed too far, you silenced him." Jacques nodded, his face a mask of defeat. "I never wanted it to come to this, but he left me no choice." The revelation brought a mix of relief and shock among the passengers. Marcelo ensured Jacques was securely held until the train reached the next stop, where he would be handed over to the authorities. As the train sped towards its destination, Marcelo reflected on the case. The web of deceit and desperation that led to Duval's murder was intricate, but he had unraveled it. The midnight train carried not only its passengers, but their darkest secrets as well, and Marcelo had brought those secrets into the light. Chapter 9. The Truth. The dining car was steeped in tense silence as everyone processed Jacques' confession. Marcelo maintained a firm stance, knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. He still felt there was more to be revealed, more secrets hidden in the shadows of this luxurious train. "Jacques," Marcelo began, his voice steady, "you killed Albert Duval to cover up your criminal connections. But how did you do it without anyone noticing? We need all the details." Jacques swallowed hard, visibly defeated. "I knew Albert was becoming increasingly suspicious of me," he said. "During our conversation in the baggage car, he threatened to expose me. I had the knife for protection, but when he tried to attack me, I stabbed him." Marcelo narrowed his eyes. "But why leave the knife in his cabin? You knew that would raise suspicions." "I panicked," Jacques admitted. "I placed the knife there hoping no one would find it until I could think of a better plan. But when the scream sounded, I knew it was too late." Madame Elvira, still seated with a tense expression, interrupted. "And you thought you could blame one of us, didn't you? Create a distraction while you tried to escape?" Jacques nodded. "I thought I could pin it on Jean-Luc, given his history with Albert. But everything happened too quickly. I lost control of the situation." Despite the confession, Marcelo knew there was still more to uncover. He turned to Jean-Luc, who looked relieved but also concerned. "Jean-Luc, you mentioned that Albert was nervous about an old business deal. Do you know if he was involved with anyone else besides Jacques?" Jean-Luc hesitated before speaking. There were rumors that Albert was trying to reconnect with old contacts to recover his money, people who weren't exactly trustworthy. Marcelo considered this new information. "So, there are more people involved who could be connected to this crime." At that moment, the child who had given the crucial clue earlier stood up again, tugging on Marcelo's sleeve. "Sir, I saw something else. Before I saw the shadow, I heard someone talking in the baggage car. It was a low voice, but it sounded like they were arguing with someone." Marcelo looked at the girl, impressed by her attention to detail. "Can you remember what was said?" The girl frowned, concentrating. "It sounded like someone was talking about money and danger. I didn't understand much, but that's what I heard." With this new information, Marcelo knew he needed to return to the baggage car to search for more clues. He signaled for the passengers to stay where they were and quickly made his way down the corridor, with Jacques and Jean-Luc following closely. In the baggage car, Marcelo began to search every corner, looking for something that could tie all the pieces together. Jacques appeared uneasy, while Jean-Luc watched intently. Finally, in one of the heavier suitcases, Marcelo found a hidden envelope. Opening it, he discovered a series of documents linking Albert Duval to a money laundering scheme involving several influential figures. Among the names mentioned, one stood out: Madame Elvira. "She was involved all along," Marcelo murmured, feeling the revelation hit him like a hammer. Madame Elvira was using Albert for her own financial schemes. When he became a risk, she planned his downfall. Back in the dining car, Marcelo confronted Elvira with the documents. "You weren't just arguing with Albert over money. You were using him to launder money. And when he found out and threatened to expose everything, Jacques did the dirty work for you." Elvira maintained her composure, but her eyes gleamed with restrained anger. "Albert was ruining our plans. I had to protect myself." "And you used Jacques as your enforcer," Marcelo continued. "You promised him safety in exchange for killing Albert. But now, everything has come to light." The train was nearing its destination, and Marcelo knew he had solved the mystery. With Jacques and Elvira in custody, he felt a sense of justice, but he also knew the impact of this crime would echo for a long time. As the train pulled into the station, Marcelo looked out at the city lights, reflecting on the complexities of human nature and the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. The midnight train had carried not just passengers, but their darkest secrets and dangerous liaisons, and Marcelo had brought those secrets into the light, ensuring that justice would be served. Chapter 10. Conclusion. The midnight train advanced slowly toward its final destination, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the horizon and illuminating the landscape. In the dining car, the tension was still palpable, but there was now a sense of closure, of truth finally emerging from the shadows. Marcelo stood, incriminating documents in one hand and his eyes fixed on Madame Elvira. The passengers watched in silence, waiting for the words that would end this nightmare. "Madame Elvira," Marcelo began, his firm voice echoing in the car. "You manipulated Albert Duval, using him to launder money and strengthen your own position. When he threatened to expose your crimes, you turned to Jacques to eliminate him." Elvira, who had always maintained an aloof demeanor, now seemed to crumble. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice trembling. "Albert was out of control. He would have destroyed everything I worked for. But justice is not in your hands," Marcelo replied. "You manipulated, betrayed, and killed to protect your own interests, and now you will face the consequences." Jacques, still stunned by the revelation, looked at Marcelo with a mixture of anger and resignation. "I never wanted to kill," he said, "but Elvira made me believe there was no other way." Marcelo looked at him, clear disapproval in his eyes. "You had a choice, Jacques. There is always a choice." Conductor Jean-Luc, who had been watching everything with a stern look, stepped forward. "This train has always been a symbol of luxury and safety. It is tragic to see it used for such abhorrent acts. I will ensure justice is served." As the train slowed down, about to reach the final station, Marcelo turned to the remaining passengers. "You were all caught in a web of lies and betrayal, But now it is time to move on. The truth has been revealed, and justice will prevail. With Jacques and Elvira in custody, the train finally stopped at the platform. The police were waiting, and Marcelo handed over the culprits to the authorities, along with all the evidence he had gathered. As the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing everything in golden light, Marcelo felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew justice had been done, but he also knew the road to truth was always difficult and full of obstacles. In the end, the truth had prevailed. But the journey on the midnight train would be remembered as a grim reminder that the deepest secrets and darkest betrayals can emerge in the most unexpected places. As the passengers disembarked, relieved to finally be free of that night of terror, Marcelo looked back one last time. The midnight train was now empty, but the echoes of what had happened there would remain forever. He stepped off the train, lighting a cigarette and watching the smoke rise into the sky. Another case solved, another truth unearthed. And so, Marcelo moved on, ready to face the next mystery that fate had in store for him.